Salam, hello, peace to you all. This is Adnan Hussein, historian of the medieval Mediterranean and Islamic world. Welcome to the channel, to the show. I'm really excited for the conversation today. Before I introduce briefly my distinguished guest, I just want to say that this is a new channel. We're trying to do some interesting things about religion, politics, and history. And if you'd like, you're welcome to share, like, and subscribe to the channel, like the video, share it with your friends on social media. It's also available on audio podcast. And if you can support the venture, you're welcome to. You can go to patreon.com/Adnan Hussein. Well, without any further ado, I'm really excited to welcome Professor Jared Ball from Morgan State University, a Black intellectual and scholar of communications and Africana studies. He's written a number of important books, but is also co-editor of a really important book that I think is worth returning to from a little over a decade ago called The Lie of Reinvention, which is a riposte, a collection of essays, which is a riposte to Manning Marable's sort of famous A Life of Reinvention, Malcolm X, A Life of Reinvention. Jared, it's great to have you on the show and wonderful to meet you. Welcome.
No, likewise. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Well, I've been looking forward to this because when this book came out, I was somebody who grew up being very interested in Malcolm X. I read his autobiography as a youth and was inspired by his, politics. And of course, as a young Muslim in America, looking for genealogies of some kind of identity that was resistant to the American ideology, both domestically and its foreign policy. I found somebody like Malcolm X who could connect these things together with racial politics as well as a kind of anti-colonial imagination, just utterly compelling. And so I read a lot of works about him, read all his speeches that I could find, and very much looked forward to what was billed as a definitive and authoritative scholarly biography of Malcolm X by the esteemed African-American historian at Columbia University, self-avowed Marxist scholar Manning Marable. So this book, A Life of Reinvention, Malcolm X, A Life of Reinvention, I found, however, while full of all kinds of details, was really an incredible disappointment. And so I was really delighted that a little over a decade ago, you and colleague, was Ted Burrows?
Dr. Todd Stephen
Todd
Burrows,
yep. Put together a volume that expressed some of the qualms that I also had with this really revisionist biography. So I wanted to give you the opportunity, here on the 100th anniversary of Malcolm Little's birth and the 60th anniversary of Malcolm X's assassination, to reflect a little bit on the legacy and particularly the intervention that this book made and why you put together this collection of critical essays that really critiqued some of the key problems of this revisionist biography. Why did you put together that volume?
Yeah. So again, thanks for the invitation. The shortest answer I can give is that the reason we put the volume together is because we were asked to by Paul Coates, the publisher of Black Classic Press, former Black Panther Party member in Baltimore, and also father of the famous writer Ta-Nehisi Coates. And for those in Black studies, they might remember Paul's inspiration for our book, which was a response, 50 years ago to William Styron's distortion of Nat Turner, which was initially titled 10 Black Writers Respond to William Styron. And Paul Coates said that he wanted us to have something, akin to that was a response to Marable's book. So that's the specifics as to why we did it. Why I think Paul reached out to me and to Todd, I often joke is that we had already marginalized ourselves enough in Black studies and communication studies to go down to take one for the team, so to speak. And but it's also because in doing some radio in DC, shout out to WPFW in Washington, DC, Dr. Burroughs and I had been among the earliest critics of what we saw happening, and then what we did in fact see happen with Marable's, the book that I started to say was attributed to Marable from Viking Press. Carl Evans was among the early critics, and we had interviewed him. There were some others, and so Paul knew that we were already in the mix, so to speak, looking at this. And the other part of it is that as Black studies scholars and around traditions of the Black radical intellectual tradition, Dr. Burroughs and I had been at conferences and had been in even spaces with Manning Marable over the years where we had been waiting. We had been hearing for a long time of Marable's work and finding the missing chapters to Malcolm's autobiography. And there was just so much talk and buildup so when the book came out, we were again already primed and ready, not only initially excited, and then I remember, hearing a couple of things, and then Carl Evans's initial critique came out, and I just remember saying, "Uh-oh." And then we finally got the book and read it carefully and saw the flaws are really infinite. And so when Paul reached out, we were happy to do it, and we tried to get a strong collective of folks to participate, because with such a big book that is Marable's and such an important topic that is Malcolm and the revolutionary ideas he worked with, I certainly didn't feel comfortable thinking that this should be an individual effort. And the other part of it was we wanted that Malcolm belongs to a community. He belongs to humanity and to revolutionaries in particular. So we didn't want, we thought there needed to be a collective community response to what was a very individual, at least in name, a product coming from Manning Marable and Viking Press. And so that's and I'm very proud of what we did and what we attempted. And I think over time, since the book came out, over the last 10 plus years, 15 years, I and others have been proven correct that Marable's goal of supplanting the autobiography as the go-to text has largely been successful, and has spawned and continues to spawn endless products and other misrepresentations of Malcolm and the struggle that he engaged. So I'm glad that we did it, and again, happy to be here to talk about it.
Yes, well, I mean, I do want to get into some of the particular corrections, because that is how you build, the volume as a correction to Manning Marable. So not just a critique, but, that there were things that were simply wrong. But of course, we know that Malcolm X's legacy has been, hotly contested for different political movements. It was then commercialized and commodified, as a part of popular American culture, where, much of the politics was, defanged or Americanized, as we might put it. So it's not like, when Marable came to this, there was a settled kind of understanding of Malcolm X. Yet some of the ways in which it's been portrayed is, that it had to be a kind of, or at least when I was thinking of what the publisher, the editor from Viking Press, what was it again? Wendy Wolf.
Wendy Wolf, yeah.
Who gave a talk, soon after the book came out, that I saw on YouTube and that I know you referred to, kind of made it seem as if, there needed to be some kind of authoritative revisionist account to deal with the, unfortunate distortions of the reception of the autobiography. And I noted that one of the kind of really crazy things was that right at the outset, she admitted and acknowledged that the autobiography she had read many decades ago as a young woman in the segregated South, and that it frightened her. Okay. And so why, this from one perspective, what is the point of any biography that attempts to displace the autobiography? The autobiography is a classic, however, the problems of its formation, the missing chapters and so on, it did something in American kind of literature, culture, and politics that inspired many people who, weren't there for Malcolm's life to hear his speeches live. But, why would there be perceived a need to displace the autobiography, which is what you said that the book was attempting to do? Manning Marable.
Well, they said that. I this isn't me speculating or opining. This is what they said. What Marable
Right.
and Wendy Wolf said, that the autobiography, they argued, was such a flawed document, given Alex Haley's political interests, giving Malcolm's political interests, and shaping it. And it is. I mean, it is a flawed document in many ways. But why I at least have, and this is where I do, some speculation is unfortunately necessary, but why I've argued at least that the Marable book was attempted, and why the ruling elite would find it so valuable, is that, to the point you alluded to, that for the most part, with all of its flaws, the autobiography, when people read it, it encouraged them and demanded that they become more radical. And a lot of people took this flawed autobiographical document and it moved them, and continues to move them far left than is sort of a sanctioned, acceptable politics. And so that's why I've always thought that it was seen as necessary to do what they've done. And as we can talk about in the as I think the epilogue more clearly than any part of the book demonstrates, they want to reframe Malcolm as someone that maybe at most the liberal wing of the Democratic Party would find acceptable, like that, that to bring him back inside from the uncomfortable and unsanctioned politics of revolutionary nationalism, socialism, Pan-Africanism, anti-colonial struggle, guerrilla warfare, all of these ideas that Malcolm was absolutely considering at the end of his life. Understandably, the ruling elite would not want us to focus on as subsequent generations pick him up. And this is sort of the point that I think is really the issue here. The foundational scholar in mass communication studies, Harold Laswell, once said that the point of propaganda is to adjust people's attitudes to a set of conditions, not to change the conditions themselves. So this is, I think, part of the point. The oppression that Black and other people around the world continue to suffer is not going to end. Clearly, we see that. So then the goal becomes, how do you adjust people's attitudes towards that oppression? And one of the many ways that this is being done is to attack revolutionary histories, revolutionary figures, symbols that Malcolm and others have come to represent throughout the world. and he is to this day one of the more popular symbols of radical thinking everywhere you go in the world. So how do you adjust yourself to that? Well, you make him seem as something that would be acceptable. And to your point about Wendy Wolf, I mean, what she said in that presentation, she said a number of many revealing confession adjacent type, but her point was, and I think this is the point, that white liberals, among others, are afraid of the politics that Malcolm represented. So one way to address themselves to it is to rebrand them and to encourage a softening and and then to undermine through a presentation of Malcolm and others as immature or other kinds of flawed figures, so that the ideas themselves are undermined. And so that's at least, somewhat of why I think the book from their perspective had to be written, and why it was given so many awards and positive reviews, and the mainstream affluent white targeting press loves Marable's book, and I think it's because of that it does try to amend how people see Malcolm and the ideas that he again tried to work with.
Mm-hmm. Yes, yeah. I mean, it occurred to me when I was reading Marable's work, which was touted as like being based on wholly new research, and of course there are elements of really new evidence. The new chapters of the autobiography, things like the diary of his
but I'm sorry to cut you off, but this is sort of the point though. Like, he doesn't get into the new there's no reveal of missing chapters, right. And the diary had been out and available for a while, and has been written about differently and interpreted differently. So that's why it's like it what Marable did wasn't this reveal that many of us had been hoping to get and see, and in fact he couldn't get the missing chapters from Gregory Reed, I believe is the man's name, who I spoke with once in an off the record conversation, and basically acknowledged that is my interpretation of the conversation, since he won't go public with it, it's and won't, there's, and his essay in another book is insufficient in describing this. The missing chapters are being held, I think, as a sort of a kind of ransom, and when they should be just turned over for the public. One thing I will say is, I told Reed, I said, I will put together a team of scholars that will work for free to edit and publish and give all the rights over to whomever, as long as the public gets to see them. And that never went anywhere. So, and to this day, we've never seen them.
Yeah, well, so no, that's very interesting about the politics of the research around the documents, the evidence, and so on. What I was referring to was the way it was touted. Right, that's why I said touted, because there were so many little glimmers that, there was going to be this amazing kind of understanding of Malcolm based on new information. But when I read the book, it just reminded me, some parts of it really reminded me of Bruce Perry's horrific, account of trying to drag, Malcolm's youth through the mud. This idea of reinvention seemed to be very much based on the idea that Bruce Perry, in his biography, I would say hit piece on Malcolm X, really tried to exploit this idea that Malcolm was trying to instrumentalize like radical politics wherever, simply because he found it lucrative or useful. It was a really horrible book, and I was shocked by how much I thought Manning Marable's account really seemed to draw from Bruce Perry's, hostile attack on Malcolm, but maybe to package it, in a slightly different way, but to take serious insights, both in terms of the overall framing of a life of reinvention, to make it seem as somehow inauthentic of, Malcolm's, kind of phases that he just kept reinventing himself according to, the audience, or the circumstances, that there wasn't a kind of core set of, deeply held principles and commitments for which he sacrificed and paid an ultimate cost. I mean, this is, really quite an astonishing approach. And so I'm wondering what some of the main kind of critiques you and other scholars in this collection really made about the central thrust, it seemed to me, of Marable's Marable's biography was trying to, under the guise of complex historical nuance and balance and thoroughness, to really undermine the authenticness of the radical politics of Malcolm X.
Well, I mean, my argument, and I'm not alone here, is that the goal of the book was to do, as I mentioned, that I think the epilogue perfectly summarizes, to depict Malcolm as someone who was quote unquote maturing out of a previous sort of political state of nature where he could be returned safely to the confines of the Democratic Party. He's described as someone who would have been supporting the U.S. state in its war against so-called terror and Al-Qaeda, and Muslim extremists, when the man himself said, these are extreme times, we need extreme responses. I mean, like it's such a bizarre, but so that's sort of the point of my contribution to our book, was to say there's been an attempt here to rebrand Malcolm as someone who was not a revolutionary. And that's why, for instance, as I point out, there's literal truncation and misrepresentation of his arguments around building independent political parties and engaging electoral politics. There's an erasure of the Organization of Afro-American Unity, his last political organization. There's a suppression of and rebranding of his work within RAM, the Revolutionary Action Movement, which was the only organization other than the Nation of Islam that he joined, that he didn't co-found, as in the case with the OAAU. There's a suppression of his advancing militancy and his prominence within more mainstream elements of the civil rights movement. That is, he was looking to engage the mainstream movement and radicalize it, and was showing signs of that being successful, given his burgeoning relationship even with King, who was himself radicalizing dangerously from the perspective of the state. And there's a suppression, obviously, of Malcolm's engagement with ideas like socialism and Pan-Africanism and revolutionary nationalism and armed struggle, and even his evolution in terms of how he. So to your point about Bruce Perry's, the comparison to Perry, Marable spends more time speculating on Malcolm's sexuality and his infidelity than pointing out his advancing radical politics as they engaged women, for instance. Mm-hmm. And that is, becoming more self-critical of the patriarchy in his work and his movements, making room for people like Lynn Shiflett and others to become leaders in the OAAU, learning from the women he met, in his travels throughout Africa, Shirley Graham Du Bois and Maya Angelou, who was at that time far more radical, and Alice Wyndham. And I mean, there was the book diminishes the radicalism of his mother, Louise Little, who is diminished, as is the broader Garvey movement of her work within the Garvey movement. All of what is done to Yuri Kochiyama in her removal from Marable's book, or her diminished capacity and reference in Marable's book, despite the importance to Malcolm that she was at the end of his life, not just being there literally at his assassination, but as someone helping expand Malcolm's politics ever more internationally and militantly and radically. So all of, so these are just some of what I and others in our collection look to point out as flaws in Marable's book, and how it would be interpreted and how it would spawn subsequent, just as part of my argument that I think is playing out to this day, subsequent research. New book came out on Malcolm, another mainstream book just a few weeks ago, and it was praising as Marable's book again as a basis for its own. Netflix and Hulu documentaries come out using it as a basis again for it. So the frame is that Marable brings and Viking Press brings to Malcolm is again spawning more and other forms of work that are all meant again to take a group of people who would traditionally pick up Malcolm and become revolutionary, given the conditions that continue to demand revolutionary reactions to them, and have those people pick up a version of Malcolm that took all of that desire for revolution and distills it and dissipates it into soft liberal activity and ultimately counterinsurgent activity, which is, I think, part of the goal here. So I hope that made sense, but that's how I'm seeing it.
No, that makes perfect sense. And you brought up so many components of where there are flaws in the de-radicalizing of Malcolm X, and that list that you just went through. I'm sure you probably could even think of many other, points to raise in that vein. But what that retelling of all of these diminishing or softening or ignoring really points out is that, towards the end of his life, Malcolm X was becoming ever increasingly radical and increasingly connecting global to the local. It goes fairly far back. Even in the 1950s, you could see he was quite interested in global affairs, maybe the prism through which he interpreted and understand and analyzed some of those anti-colonial movements, or things like the Bandung Conference of 1955 that he returned to over and over again in his speeches in the late 50s. May have developed and become a lot more sophisticated because of his own interactions, as you said, in both domestically with different political groups, but through his travels abroad and connecting and, meeting with anti-colonial activists, thinkers, and leaders in Africa and the Middle East. And so the book really just it documents a lot of things in a very detailed way, which provides this kind of sense of authoritative historical, thoroughness, while diminishing and ignoring very key and important things that are not important, not only to him then in his life and in the development of his thinking and in his experience, but also in, what's useful for a legacy. I would think a Marxist historian's approach to Malcolm X would be thinking about what is the usable past, right? This is the point. But none of that is important, is brought in. One just quick point. You mentioned, his connection with radical feminists and anti-colonial women activists. He himself made the remark that everywhere he went, where he saw women more equally incorporated into the society, those societies were advancing, making progress, able to develop economically and politically to defend their sovereignty, and that was, a kind of model. So
he also said those societies were more likely than not to be socialist.
That's right. Exactly. That's right. That they were more likely to be socialist, indeed. So, I think it's very important to have this recounting and accounting of the problems of this book. But I would say, for me, the two biggest insufficiencies are, one, this diminishing, as you were saying, of this transnational kind of anti-colonial imagination and politics that he's mentioning, which again, it has its roots. It's not as if it comes out of nowhere. Already in the 1950s and 60s, early 60s, he's saying, we're not American. That's the problem, is that we are not allowed to be American, and we don't want civil rights. We want human rights. We want to take this, into a global frame and trying to connect the radical possibilities of anti-colonial movements that were happening around the world to reframe the struggle, for freedom within, for Black liberation within the United States, as not a minority struggling, against a majority, but saying, hey, there's a majority in the world that is looking for freedom. We're part of that struggle, and we're connected with that struggle. So the Americanizing, I think that's a key kind of problem here, is trying to frame it within an acceptable American idiom and language and frame. And the second one that I would say is terribly insufficient when it comes to thinking about, religion and faith and its role in his senses of solidarity with the larger kind of peoples of, you could say now, we would say the global South, and what that meant. And so those are two avenues I'm wondering if we could kind of discuss a little bit further, and maybe we'll start with the transnational, one. What do you think is at stake in those later years of Malcolm X, where he had experience to add to earlier analysis that he already had about the important role of connecting the struggle for Black liberation and freedom and justice, economically, socially, politically, in the United States with what was happening, in the world? How did that make him, I would suggest, particularly radical? Like, it seems to me like when you look at the FBI files and the documents collected on his activities in the Department of State kind of records, and probably many other documents that have yet to be released to the public, it seems that his activities to undermine U.S. foreign policy abroad were seen as incredibly dangerous by the U.S. state. So what kind of lessons can we learn, and why is, about resurfacing, that component of his radical politics and analysis beyond the kind of U.S. frame?
So, I mean, there's a lot happening today around how Black America should see itself and identify itself, and in some ways delineate and separate itself from the diaspora and focus on its own. And this is not to deny that Black America has its own specific and particular experience and history, as all people do. But it is to say that whatever people think about that, what has been, without a doubt and without any speculation or lack of clarity, what has been made very, very clear is that the state has, from its inception, wanted Black people in this country to see themselves as distinct and separate from everyone else in the world. That there has been any number of ongoing efforts, even at one point in the 19th century, to say, if you want to identify as an African, you must go back. There will be no so-called free African people in this society. You're either Black American, and what that means, or you gotta go. So from the perspective of the state, even as I keep talking about, the Guardian newspapers recently, as a couple of years ago, was talking about how the British were finally admitting the extent to which they went to suppress Kwame Ture and his efforts over the last 50 years to spread socialism and Pan-Africanism. So again, they're very clear. Whatever we think about ourselves and our relationship to the world, that part I think needs to be understood. So when Malcolm, who, big shout out to my comrade Hiram Rivera, who inspired a series that I co-hosted on Black Liberation Media. This, one was 100 years of Malcolm X to commemorate his 100th birthday, and we culminated that on May 19th, his actual birthday. And I encourage people to go watch that series on Black Liberation Media. We're extending the series now to cover Fanon and Lumumba, whose 100th birthdays are also, as is Robert Williams. 1925 was a monster.
What a year! What a year!
And I want to say, no, May 19th is also Yuri Kochiyama. No, I mean Ho Chi Minh and Yuri Kochiyama's birthday, right? Now I'm confused. Anyway, but in that series, the point the reason I'm bringing it up is that revisiting some of this to help produce that series, I, learned some new things, remembered some new things. One of them was the point that, as I mentioned a moment ago, Malcolm's mother has often, as is the case in the autobiography, reduced to someone who is a background player and someone who just sort of lost her mind and was uninvolved, but this is a misrepresentation, and part of what reason I'm getting at is that Malcolm's international perspective was inculcated from the beginning. Both of his parents were Garveyites, so were active in the Garvey movement, his mother included. So he was learning she herself was from the Caribbean. So he was learning in the home the importance of diaspora and African revolution and Black radicalism, and the interconnectedness of the struggle here with struggles elsewhere. So he was already sort of being introduced to that, only to revisit it after being imprisoned and entering the Nation of Islam. So when he revisits that again in the context of world revolution as an adult, as a evolving thinker and leader himself, it just was a natural progression for him to recognize, again, whatever our biases and whatever our particular experiences are, there is no freedom for Black people or anyone else connected specifically to this project called the United States. There is if your bias and sole concern is the freedom of Black people here in the United States, disconnecting that struggle, disconnecting those people from the broader African diaspora and other radical struggles is just a tactical flaw. And Malcolm was very clear on that, and as were a lot of the people that were inspiring him, and starting with his mother and some of the other women that I mentioned, and then other leaders of the day. I mentioned, Robert Williams. Robert Williams was himself an inspiration to Malcolm X, and was himself an internationalist, and was himself one of the first to introduce Malcolm to the idea of urban guerrilla warfare as a viable concept that Malcolm picked up on all the way through his time as a member of the Revolutionary Action Movement, which Robert Williams eventually became a leader of. So all of that to say is that internationalism has always been essential to Malcolm X and to all revolutionaries. And then in the context of the other part of your question, Malcolm also understood that Islam connected him to a world community of Muslims. And as he left the Nation of Islam and became a Sunni Muslim himself and made the Hajj again, because people like to leave out that he had actually been to Mecca in the nation. But when he makes his actual Hajj, those ideas are expanded yet again. But what I think is always important to point out, and I admit this in terms of my own biases as an atheist and a non-religious person, Malcolm was also very clear. This isn't the argument or the differences we need to, he literally said, keep your religion in the closet. And I would say for those of us who are atheists, we need to do the same thing. Sometimes we get a little bit aggressive in our atheism. And I think to his point, that needs to be as much in the closet as well, because all of it, to really focus on what Malcolm was advocating, all of it needs to be suppressed or sublimated in terms of our time here to the struggle for liberation of and decolonization of people all around the world. So this is why he was able to be so clear about his internationalism, his anti-capitalism, his anti-colonialism, and his anti-Zionism. It all overlapped. His Islam, his Africanity, his understanding of the solidarity of working and colonized people, all of it, I think, overlapped and fed nicely into what became his eventual politics and arguments, but specifically his global outlook.
Yes, definitely. And I do think that it was important for him to have multiple ways of connecting and thinking of having a global community. So as you pointed out, his Africanness, Islam as a kind of ummah, kind of faith community that he could be connected. These were all transnational kinds of affiliations, of political imagination that, of course, would fuel struggle within a national context, but not separate and apart from an understanding of the global connections and the importance of confronting U.S. empire, in the world. He talked a lot about dollarism as a new colonialism, like, in the post-colonial period where there might have been, radical revolutionary movements, but if they were still contained in a, financial and economic system with U.S. hegemony and capitalism at the very kind of framework and structure of it, that was also going to be oppressive. And so it's definitely true that he had a kind of, we would call it a secular, political, and transnational vision, but he accommodated and had a place for his own personal commitments and faith within that, from which he drew a great deal of strength. But it reminds me at least a little bit of the question I wanted to sort of end on in thinking about his relevance and legacy for us today in the world that we're inhabiting and facing is, again, that point about also his anti-Zionism and recognizing that in many ways, there has been some discomfort about, affiliating with and showing and demonstrating solidarity with the Palestinian resistance, because much of it has been expressed within the framework or language of faith. And that sometimes makes some parts of the secular Western, particularly secular left, uncomfortable. What would the Palestinian resistance be without deep resources of resilience, that come from their sense of faith? I mean, they don't necessarily express their liberation has to be, they are very capable of articulating, a kind of political, national liberation in the typical language. But what would they be without, that sense of faith? But I did want to ask, what you thought was the broader relevance in our time of his particular critiques of U.S. empire, of Zionism. I note that he wrote a short piece during his travels in an Egyptian kind of a newspaper or kind of weekly magazine about Zionism. He had just visited Gaza, in fact, and there's some famous photos of him in the Gaza Strip in 1964. And, upon returning to Cairo, he penned a piece that was a really interesting historical critique. And he made a fascinating analogy between, claims from thousands of years. He said, well, the Moors were in Spain, less than 1,000 years ago. Should they, have rightful claim to parts or all of Spain today, and so I just thought he was a very interesting kind of figure, making these analogies and these critique to really fundamentally, argue that the displacement of an indigenous population couldn't be justified, through settler colonialism. As somebody who was a victim of a settler colonial society, he had a deep, understanding of it. But so I just wanted to ask you, given the state of the world, And you mentioned yourself his anti-Zionism. What do you think are the kind of key ways in which the legacy and the politics of Malcolm X can help us understand and confront the oppression of our world today?
I mean, this is the thing, as you point out. I mean, everything that Malcolm was struggling against is still happening today, and in some cases is worse. And Gaza is probably a good example of that. I mean, I don't think it could be argued things have gotten better since his assassination in that region. And the conditions of African people all around the world, the condition of Muslims all around the world, the condition of, something I don't like to speculate. I think it's inappropriate, but I would at least say that one thing I would like to think Malcolm, given the trajectory he was on, would have picked up on a little bit more are the contradictions within the Islamic world, and specific to Palestine. And it seems perfectly consistent with where he was going and his commentary on African leaders, that he would have been more aggressive in calling out the rest of the Islamic world and saying, how are we letting all this continue to happen to our Palestinian brothers and sisters? Like how, because this is exactly his argument as it pertained to Africans in the United States and elsewhere. That is, look at the state of your leadership, and what is the state of that leadership's relationship to actual liberation? And he was also very clear in arguing about what does liberation and revolution mean. It does. And so everything that he was looking to work with, including urban guerrilla warfare, radical approaches to the vote, independent political parties, anti-capitalism, anti-Zionism, anti-colonialism, socialism, communism, radical revolutionary nationalism, all of these ideas that he was struggling with and looking to form into a particular approach are relevant today. We revisited his discussion with Jan Carew at the end of his life, very shortly before he was assassinated. And Malcolm was clearly, in a very humbling way, struggling to figure out what to do here, always skewing back to the most militant and revolutionary arguments. Including saying to African Americans or Africans in America who wanted to venture out into the world and into the diaspora, including Shirley Graham Du Bois, Maya Angelou, and others that he met in Ghana, he was saying, you got to come back. You got to build these ties with the diaspora, but you can't just expatriate for good. You got to come back. He said himself, he told Carew told him, why don't you just disappear for a while? Let things cool off. And Malcolm, even knowing what was likely facing him, he said, I cannot just abandon my people in the United States and the struggle at this time and this moment. I got to be there. So to be fair to my generational cohort and those coming up behind me, what Malcolm warned in his own lifetime is only this, I'm confident has gotten worse. When Malcolm said in his lifetime that the United States had perfected the science of image making, for those of us who have studied the U.S. mass communication research industry and its history, that was their goal, to perfect the science of image making. And that's why they built the field that I and others are degreed in, to specifically study how to manipulate public opinion in the service of empire. And so my point is, the only room that I'm willing to give myself and my cohort and those coming behind me is that we have all emerged and evolved in an increasingly complicated or counterinsurgent environment, where the levels of propaganda and psychological warfare are at maximum levels, at levels we've never seen before, are their most pernicious and penetrative and ubiquitous. And we really are in a civilizational crisis of methodology in terms of how people come to recognize the conclusions that they're drawing. How do you know what you know, and why do you like what you like? And a lot of what Malcolm represented and what he was encouraging us to consider is being rebranded into forms of activity that are antithetical to what Malcolm was calling for, and that would bring us or any other group of people any form of liberation. So, and it's more difficult to see. I think it's becoming more of a sophisticated and complicated enemy that is our media environment. That, as Marshall McLuhan said, created us as the fish who don't discover water, because an all-pervasive environment is always beyond perception. And, not that I like to quote Eurocentric old white guys, but McLuhan, was right. He was absolutely right in that regard. And Malcolm was calling it out even before McLuhan was, now that I think about it. And it's become a major problem. So I'll just stop my rant here with what Kwame Ture said, that Black power is not Black visibility, or Black visibility is not Black power. And more than ever, we have to be more careful in how so much of the prevalent images of Blackness and Black history, and even references to Malcolm X, are not helping us understand the people and the ideas nominally referenced in those products and in that effort. So, yeah.
Well, I think those are excellent words to revive our understanding of Malcolm's legacy and his prescience. I think just in that last point that you made, he was somebody who very early saw through the politics of representation, perhaps because of being in a very outsider position and in a organization that really refused to collaborate with the state structure, with official culture, and so on. But it gave him a position very early on to already be calling out the way in which Black leadership could be co-opted, to be representatives of a community that now they were somewhat divorced from, and that was the whole point, to domesticate their politics. So in so many ways, if we look to his speeches, his interviews, his example, there's so many ways in which he was so far ahead of his time, which is why, just as you said, so many of the things continue or have gotten worse since then. His critique, his analysis, and his understanding remain so alive and so fresh, which is why radical groups, revolutionaries around the world continue to find great inspiration in his words and in his legacy. And I really want to thank you for not only your time and remarks today, but for much of your career being dedicated to reminding us of many of these kind of pitfalls, and also for going against the grain, against establishment, academia that all hailed this book as the authoritative word on Malcolm X by an eminent and celebrated scholar as their last will and testament, as it were.
I'm sorry to jump in again,
yeah.
and you remind me of something I did want to say, and so again, I wanted to thank you for this invitation, because one of the things that I admit really frustrated me at the time, and still does, is that I made jokes about my career and that of my colleague and all of that, but the reality is that a number of prominent, thinking, well-situated to comment on this scholars and others didn't want to publicly be associated with a critique of Manning Marable, in part because of the large figure that he was in Black studies and elsewhere in academia, the purse strings that he was associated with, the university he was associated with, the name, the brand. In fact, one of Zahir Ali, I've been making this point and calling it out for years now. I mean, he told me to my face that he wanted, that though he had not much to do with the book, he wanted his name associated with the book because, as he said, he was building his own brand. So it has been frustrating. Like, I get it. I don't have a certain academic career, so that I wouldn't have to worry about some massive fall from grace. But the reality is that more importantly than our careers is the accurate representation of someone and a set of ideas that are so important, and that so many were so willing to say, I don't want it. I don't want to be involved. I don't want to engage. And we did get, I mean, it has not helped my career or that of my colleague. It has not been a benefit. We have been ignored or disparaged or, for having done what we did. But what has still not been done is someone taking pen to paper or ink to whatever or type to whatever to show how what I or others in our book said was wrong.
Right. I mean, this is the important legacy, is to tell the truth. And, those words, will last and outlast some of the other calculations, that people make for, advantage or concern, for self-preservation or career advancement and so on. And that's one of the reasons why I was so glad that you've done that work and wanted to bring you on, because I think it's very important at this time when, people are thinking about and celebrating Malcolm X's various, his birth and remembering, his assassination, we get it right and really take the lessons that are relevant and inspiring for a radical revolutionary politics that Malcolm X was committed to in his life and career. So I really thank you for that. And let's just say, though, that, the reputation and status of that institution, Columbia University, has been severely diminished, as well, in time. So, it's not even just an eminent scholar at this great, powerful and important institution. Those things are constructs of the society and culture, but there is the movement of history, and there is the continuing dedication to the real legacies and the truth. And, God willing, I'll say from my side, these will, continue to outlast those evanescent and meaningless barriers to really, achieving the world that, we all want together. And so thank you so much for this, really wonderful conversation and for your reflections on Malcolm X. There's so much more that, one could talk about Malcolm X and his reception and, even this book, though I think we've done, a reasonable job in making sure listeners and viewers look to other sources if they want to connect with Malcolm X's ideas and so on. But I want to thank you again, and I hope that this will be the beginning of other future conversations on these sorts of topics.
No, likewise. Thank you very much for the invitation. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you. And listeners, peace and solidarity to you all. Until next time.